Stop. Stop. Don't leave, please. I swear I'm wearing clothes. See? Look. Decent. Decent. No selling out. The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan is the first book of a 15-book classic epic fantasy book series that is world famous with a huge following, which is arguably also has partially a cult following. Every book is roughly around 1,000 pages, and the overall style of the book takes a long time to read because the world building is so unbelievably, geniusly jam-packed that it's like every line elicits a new idea, a new thing to envision, and by its implication, it is the saddest, most mysterious, spooky, and most interesting world that I've ever experienced in fiction. Not counting large, epic sci-fi universes. I mean universes in fiction that are confined to one planet, like this book, which has the feel and voyage aspect, like going on a voyage in a medieval fantasy type setting. And so all of these attributes I just stated are both, the greatest, most wonderful things about this book and this book series, and they're also some of the most frustrating things. And so I want to talk about this a little bit, but not in too much detail. But because I only have so much time, and so do you, my book review videos, they summarize the key tips and takeaways, and I wish I had time to get into more detail. I could easily drop 5 hours talking about just this first book alone, and so it's just so packed, and I'm so passionate about the construction of this novel as a writing nerd, as a storytelling nerd, as much as I am a fanboy of this book series. So I am kind of at a loss for words here, but in summary, the characters are heroic, admirable, not terribly memorable for being a bit bland. All the other key components of your typical epic fantasy story and series are there, but that's not what's extraordinary. The most extraordinary takeaway of The Wheel of Time for me is the sense of journey and energy in the unfolding mystery and the search for answers and self-discovery through understanding one's own relationship with investments of power in general, coupled with that power's relationship with the world, especially through its history. And that history is plopped so far in the future Earth setting that everything is retroactively discovered without too much explanation and without too little explanation, to make everything feel truly mysterious and magical and foreboding, as well as sad. Because by implication, one thing is for sure, although most things are vague at best, and that is that this world has been destroyed and rebuilt by humans so many times because of the immoral or the misuse of energy. And so, rather than traditional modern Western, views of stories with good and evil and archetypes, like especially in more commercial epic fantasy, this one seems to have a more universal, like hybrid view from many different cultures that really makes it feel more universally resonant and timeless. In other words, this book series and its popularity are never going anywhere. It is pretty much timeless, and that is, for example, that view states a lot of morality is left up to individuals and is not at all black and white, and is neither determined by society. And one of the most genius, perspectives this book takes is letting the reader decide what of the societies and their opposing theologies and how they view the what actually happened in history concerning that misuse of power and or positive use, especially as it concerns this prophesied figure that is set to appear that can bring the apocalypse. In some cultures, it's someone that's going to save them from tyranny. It's going to be someone to be worshipped. And just the idea of it alone has a long history of creating civil wars in a world that's, or many wars, including civil wars, that in a world that's perpetually chaotic and therefore reflective of actual human history in a way that is appropriately discomforting and tragic. And that makes everything feel meaningful, even when the book has its shortcomings, like the occasional poor attempts at humor, blandness, dryness, and what can sometimes feel like a chore to get through world building for us more internet commercial brained, like poop brained westernized or American, audiences. It can really feel slightly dated in its delivery, but timeless in the execution of all these other essential story building elements that I've mentioned so far. Characters not so much, but the archetypes, there's an art to doing tropes flawlessly that just cements the reality of why tropes are tropes in the first place. And you could look at this book as being taking a million billion different pieces of other past universally appealing stories and smashed together and overanalyze it to death. And for example, you could see a lot of the same narrative story beats as too similar to Lord of the Rings, if you choose to see it that way. But you also can't ignore that it's such a titan of originality, even if it was doing that, because it's so stuffed with information and different perspectives and magic systems and different theological views towards power in general, and so much content, so many asides and intertwining character arcs, so sometimes good romances, other times rivalries and so on. Although it's not particularly masterful in its delivery of human drama like something like George Martin, and it is much more heroic and perhaps slightly unrealistically so, whitewashed in a way, especially when you see the contrast, opposition to the heroes. The main antagonist, Balzamonda, is not only the typical boring Dark Lord, and while stylistic cinematic moments of his entry into the dreams of the characters is good, his personality itself is empty and lacking a backstory that never really comes, to me personally, in a more relatable, satisfying sort of evil that seems like a missed opportunity, and sometimes to me slightly breaks the illusion of reading and makes the author a little transparent. And that is one small flaw to me. And so there's many other little ones, but they're not really worth mentioning because the complete package as a whole, the pros vastly outweigh the cons. This is like a foundational piece of fantasy, not just fantasy, but fiction that is going to maintain universal appeal forever. It really is. It could probably cross cultural and language boundaries, and that is part of the compelling mysticism of the constant question that could be generally summarized as why are tropes resonant profoundly to us humans interested in imagination and such in the first place in stories, and is there some larger cognitive realm interweaved with some sort of pre-existent spiritual state? Are there ways to draw influence or inspiration from those things? It almost is if, in a mystical meta fashion, the very art of reading this book stretches the mind while opening imagination with emotionally inspiring, and perhaps also spiritually resonant heroic scenes, as to be in and of itself almost a mystical activity or phenomenon. which you won't be able to really believe unless you have deposit some faith and summon a lot of patience and actually read this book. Otherwise, you will have no idea what I'm talking about. So, it really does feel, although there's a lot of cliches, they're done so authentically, so well, by an author who at times you're tempted to think is a con artist in his endlessly multiplying questions, like the television show Lost. For every door that, like for every question that's answered, you open 3 more doors to 3 more expanding questions. And sometimes you wonder if the Jordan was smothered by his own, like endlessly multiplying ambition in a way for creating such a large world with so far in the future that there's so much backstory for contemplation, almost similar to Frank Herbert's Dune, that he was probably being smothered by the threat of plot holes. And sometimes the story does feel like it's getting ahead of itself and going off of energy and making promises it doesn't always keep. What I mean by that is, while I do believe that Robert Jordan was writing from the heart and discover writing partially with a few set narrative outcomes in mind and intentions of the book, I also think that he largely believed in the soul of what he was doing, but may have exaggerated the how, meaning he introduced a lot of big epic ideas that suggest this coming revelation regarding the intentions and identities of the forces that have made this ongoing manifestation throughout the history of this book series, like the Dragon Reborn being reincarnated and destroyed again in the future, etc., the Dark One and the Aes Sedai, and so on and so forth. And I think that he might have used subconscious meditation techniques to try to find some larger story that was resonant with all humanity, and he believed in what he was doing. But at the same time, I think he might have been a little bit blinded by his own, introspective insight into himself, and started to sort of develop a slight bit of a god complex, as makes a lot of sense, as him being the metaphorical god of this fictional universe. And that might have resulted in a story that at times feels like it uses dream sense. Meaning, if you look at it logically, you're going to be extremely frustrated by the seemingly endless number of unanswered questions, which, especially in sometimes the language that the book uses to suggest that there's some greater meaning behind an event that might happen, it can be particularly annoying to people who appreciate outcomes and plot twists and stories more than the actual ride and journey itself. Meaning, this book will frustrate and drain your patience and exhaust you with its seemingly endless multiplying of unexplained phenomenon and mysteries, but at the same time make it so engaging. It almost feels like it's tricking you and robbing you, very, very similar, maybe perhaps intentionally, perhaps not, perhaps subconsciously, as Moiraine is somewhat manipulating and also somewhat encouraging her, the main characters, to follow her across the country, the lands, the nations, on some wild goose chase, because they are so overwhelmed, they feel like the reader feels, in a way where they're so overwhelmed by the possibility of knowledge they don't yet have about who they are, what they're doing, why they're involved in the pattern, the Wheel of Time, this larger hand of fate that is in one sense metaphorical, but Moiraine suggests that it's literal. And there's so little that we know, and so much of it is left to the reader's imagination. It can be quite daunting. It can be quite scary to really process this world, and with the type of language used, because it can feel frustrating mentally and draining emotionally as you read. Which is, in one part, I enjoy the challenge. Another part, it kept me wanting more of an explanation. So the reading process itself has always been a love-hate relationship, but I don't regret reading this huge book twice. You can see I got it really dirty. So I have to give this book a 9 out of 10, maybe a 9.5 or 9.3, almost perfect, but not quite. But it's it's a book that I'll never forget, that I remember just about every major scene from. I really like the first book. First three books all kind of feel like one book, and they don't. As far as I know, I've only read the first three books, when like half of the fourth book, and this was my second time reading the first book. I'm rereading the series, and this time I intend to finish it. So there's a lot I don't know about the world, but a lot of it is predictable for me personally. Like, I've predicted a lot of outcomes, but I'm sure there's surprises that wait. But so far, I'm not really reading it for the surprises. I'm reading it for the journey, and to be confronted introspectively with the possibilities of my own imagination, and how I see foundational universal anomalies like power itself, good and evil, so on and so forth. I could speculate and talk about The Eye of the World forever, really. It's very hard to summarize any review of this book. It's at times abstract, at times it's the most oldest story of all time, the most foundational story of like becoming something through confronting the reality of the chaos aspect of evil ingrained in nature, even our own nature, and how it sometimes tempts and works through us. But in the process, it evokes hope, because it implies that there's growth of the self and meaning gained in the process that gives a promise of control, and that gives a promise of inner peace, whereby a mind cannot literally survive without and contemplate itself at the same time, which is probably why obtaining too much of the one power is what corrupts and causes a male Aes Sedai to go insane. That's one theory, conversely. So anyway, The Eye of the World, I would say it might as well be as close as we get to a high epic fantasy masterpiece. Once more, I want to say the world and the world building, by its implication, is in some ways the most epic world I've ever encountered, because it's the most tragic, and everything has a sense of weight. Like, all of this has already happened so many times, and it's a repeating pattern, and there's this weird hybrid of both chaos and peace that come from that. And so universal spiritual and human philosophical themes and tone and ideals, very strong. Sometimes the ambition might diminish its personality and remove some of the what could have otherwise been more uniqueness. Like, for example, better humor. Humor is like, it's so bland that it's actually oddly charming in an ironic way for me personally. So yeah, I could, but I better shut up now because I'm boring myself. But yeah, I love and sort of hate this book like a family member. You love them, but sometimes they get on your nerves because you know them really well. And so if you like epic fantasy, this is probably a must read. Warning, it will take a great deal of time to read, and one must read it with a lot of patience and a big open mind. And I've tried to avoid spoilers. I don't think I've truly spoiled anything, but I think it's good to know what not to expect, and don't expect everything to make sense, and try to have a sense of the present moment. That's the best way I could give advice for reading this book series. You might think you can just easily get all that it's worth because you're some kind of genius and you can just blow through the book series, and that's not how this book series is meant to be read. It's meant to be read slowly and contemplatively, with not the spirit of rushing through it, because to visualize the world, it's such a big world that, as big as these books are, there's just frankly not enough time to describe in a more artful way peculiar aspects. And that's one other thing I forgot to say. I wouldn't say the prose even, or the intent of the book is about art. It's about chasing principles of reality through the mirror of, or the lens of fiction, in a way, if you will. And that, in a very American way, makes it a very dramatic, high energy, chaotic experience, which, if this is not the Tolkien, or Pat Rothfuss fantasy to cuddle up and light a candle to and read, this is something that's all about confronting evil and recognizing the evil within yourself as a fundamental, in mortal terms, immovable part of reality that needs to be faced. And that is something that modern Western audiences could benefit from a lot, as so many of us prefer to live in a delusional, prolonged childhood safe fantasy where evil doesn't exist and all things are secularly redefined according to our individual narcissistic delusional God complex to make everything comfortable. But the reality is that inner peace is only found through confronting opposition, both through one's environment, the world, the attacks, and the opposition, the forces of chaos that often work through evil and disease and malignant forces like evil plants, animals, creatures, humans, spirits, demons, all the sorts of things that, we could establish the wrong link with ourselves if not careful, and yield ourselves to if, for example, we were to surrender to things like sloth, gluttony, lust, greed, vice, avarice, etc., and allowed to work through us as, like the theme of Matt with the dagger, etc., reminiscent like Frodo tempted by the ring in a way. So, I could go on and on, but I should really shut up now. I said I would before, but then I went on another tangent because, it's hard not to talk about such a meaningful, deep books. And so, yes, The Eye of the World, the first book of Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series, I believe was published in 1990. Yes. Read it. It's good. This is the eye. And you're the world.